Welcome back. Today we're going to look at the period from the end of the War of 1812 with Britain until 1828, the election of Andrew Jackson as president. And during this period, we're going to focus on the tension between increasing the power and scope of the federal government versus that of the states, as well as sectionalism, which at this period of time is largely the North versus the South, and to some extent the West. There's a fundamental tension between nationalism, the desire to have one nation, a united nation, and sectionalism. Do people think of themselves as Northerners, Southerners, or from their state? We saw before during the colonial period, people tended to identify with their state. And this continues to a large extent till the Civil War. But because of the divisive issue of slavery, the expansion of slavery, and economic differences, particularly trade policy, we see the country splitting more and more between North and South. As we saw previously, after the War of 1812, and particularly Andrew Jackson's decisive victory at the Battle of New Orleans versus the British, there was a great increase in nationalism, a sense that the nation was on the move. And at this time, President Madison, who was a reluctant Federalist, realized that the country needed to build up a stronger federal government and expand westward. So we see Madison supported increasing the size of both the Army and Navy, starting another national bank, and providing significant tariffs to protect small American industry from foreign competition, particularly British competition. President Madison set up the Second Bank of the United States, which was an attempt to provide a common currency to promote economic trade among the states. Previously, each state had its own currency, and oftentimes merchants in one state would not accept the currency of another state. Today, the Bank of the United States is known as the Federal Reserve Board, and it has the same basic purpose today, which is to promote economic growth and price stability. In 1860, shortly after the ending of the war with Britain, Congress passed a tariff, and this was a protective tariff designed to protect so-called infant American industry. The reasoning then, and it continues to this very day in the United States and other countries, is if you have new industries, they can't possibly compete against large established industries in other countries. So the government should impose a tariff on imports from other countries to allow the United States or industry to develop. And these tariffs at the time were around 20 to 25%, which was a very, very large tax on imports. And of course, the problem then, as the problem now with protective tariffs, is that they're seldom removed because the industries appreciate the elimination of competition. The important political point is because industry, as we've seen previously, was focused in the Northeast, much more so in the South, the tariff benefited the North much more than the South. And as I've indicated in the slide in red, this greatly intensified sectional tensions. As we saw in greater detail in the previous class, the country needed internal improvements to provide for expanded commerce. And so we see the federal government moving into financing of roads, bridges, canals, and harbors, either direct financing or provided land grants to private companies. They particularly needed a network of roads and later railroads because most of the rivers in the United States tend to flow from north to south, and west of the Mississippi River, particularly, there are not very many rivers with the exception of the Missouri. At the same time, the Supreme Court played a very active role in promoting a national economy and a stronger national government. In general, the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution to allow for a stronger federal government at the expense of states' rights. We saw previously the famous decision in 1803, Marbury versus Madison, in which the Supreme Court decided on its own that it had the right to declare a law unconstitutional. Now the Supreme Court took a series of steps to further strengthen the role of the federal government. It ruled that the U.S. Constitution, federal laws, and treaties entered with other countries were the supreme law of the land, and they could only do so if the Supreme Court had the power to review and overturn decisions of the state courts. So these were major decisions. You can read the details in the textbook of Martin versus Hunter's Lessee and Cohen's versus Virginia. You don't need to get too involved in the details, but the important point is the Supreme Court now set it up as having the power to overturn decisions of state courts, and there is nothing about this in the Constitution. Also, in the Dartmouth College case, and again, you can read the details in the textbook, the Supreme Court moved decisively to protect contract rights. This was a crucial decision for the development of the United States economy, because no modern economy can operate if contract rights are not upheld by the courts. A very significant Supreme Court decision was the case McCulloch versus Maryland. Again, you should read the short section in the textbook about this regarding the details. And in this instance, the court decided to protect the new national currency that had been established as part of the Bank of the United States. The decision was important for two reasons. One was protecting the very concept of a national currency, and the other was this was a very, very broad decision that said that Congress had the right to essentially do anything if it wasn't forbidden by the Constitution, if the purpose of the action, the legislation, was within the scope of the Constitution. And this is as interpreted by Congress, and of course then as interpreted by the Supreme Court. This is almost 180 degrees from the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which basically says that the federal government only has those powers that are explicitly given to it by the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court in the McCulloch case is saying the federal government can, or the Congress can do anything if it's not forbidden by the Constitution. And this, they use the phrase an implied power. And this principle in McCulloch has been consistently used by the courts and Congress to this very day. The Supreme Court also gave the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce, which is absolutely crucial. And the case there that you should know is Gibbons versus Ogden. Again, you don't need to know all the details of the case, but you should know why the case is important, and that's that the federal government was given priority over the states in regulating interstate commerce. The net result was the the power of the federal government was greatly expanded by these Supreme Court decisions. Particularly the decision on interstate commerce gave the federal government, authority to intervene virtually any time it wanted to. Think of your life today. How many things do you have in your life or actions that don't involve interstate commerce broadly defined? Your laptop clearly was not manufactured in Texas, or if it was assembled here, the parts would come from elsewhere. So there's virtually everything now that the federal government, if it wants to, can assume jurisdiction. And we'll see in History 1302 how the Interstate Commerce Clause was used extensively by the federal government in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, and for one of the reasons for the courts to intervene. And there was a famous case involving a restaurant in the South that refused to allow black customers, and the two FBI agents went down there to try and investigate how the federal government could get jurisdiction. And one thing they noticed was the chicken that was being served was produced in another state, and therefore the restaurant was involved in interstate commerce and subject to federal laws. In addition to economic and tariff issues, the sectional controversy centered over the issue of expansion of slavery into the new territories in the West. Again, you recall that these territories were all controlled by the national government, whether they were acquired through the Louisiana Purchase, or as we'll see shortly, as a result of the war with Mexico in the 1840s. And as these territories gained settlers, once they reached a certain number of inhabitants, the territories had the right to send a petition to Congress to ask to become a state. And then the crucial question is, will they be a slave state or a free state? And in fact, this issue of the expansion of slavery into these new territories was the biggest debate of the 19th century, and a major factor that, as we'll see, led to the Civil War. Well, in 1819, there were an equal number of slave and free states. There were 11 of each, and given that each state had 2 senators, the slave and free states were balanced in the Senate. However, in 1819, the Missouri Territory applied for statehood, and they applied to be a slave state. Now, this became very controversial because doing so would change the balance of power in the Senate, and this was at a time when the House of Representatives was controlled by the slave states. So a compromise was reached, and the compromise was that the state of Massachusetts, which was much larger than it is today, a part of it, the northern part of it, would apply for statehood as the state of Maine as a free state. And nobody talked about slavery in Maine. Nobody in the South wanted slavery in Maine. Maine, as you know, is in the far northeastern part of the United States, and it's very, very cold climate. So certainly plantation type of slavery could not exist there. So this led to the Missouri Compromise, and be sure you know the elements of the Missouri Compromise. We'll see these on the next slide. So the compromise was that Missouri would become a slave state and Maine a free state, as we just discussed. Also, in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, which was federal territory, slavery was banned forever everywhere else in the Louisiana Purchase, and that's north of 36 degrees, 30 minutes, which is Missouri's southern boundary, as you can see on the map on the next slide. Well, the compromise really didn't settle much. People in the in the North were outraged that Missouri had become a free state. People in the South, while pleased that Missouri was a slave state, were outraged that the rest of what would have been the Louisiana Purchase would not have slavery. And here we can see a map of the compromise, with the green states being the free states, the slave states, the orange color, and you can see there Missouri, which entered as a slave state. In terms of diplomacy with other countries, there was a treaty with Britain at this time which settled the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, and they came up with what's actually now the current national boundary between U.S. and Canada for most of the U.S. and Canada, and that was in a convention in 1818. And then in the same following year, 1819, there was a treaty with Spain, the Adams-Onis Treaty, named after the foreign ministers of each country, in which Spain agreed to give the United States $45 million in return for adjusting slightly the barrier or the boundary between what's now Texas and the United States. So here you can see on this slide what we're talking about. Florida now becomes part of the United States. We have the Convention of 1818 with Britain setting the boundary between the United States and Canada, where you see the red line. Now, in the very northwestern section of the United States, so-called Oregon country, the United States and Britain disagreed on ownership of this fairly large area, and that was not settled for a number of years later. But there were relatively few inhabitants there. And you can also see the Spanish possessions here. This is just a few years before the revolution in Mexico, which led to Mexican independence. But you can see the line, the boundary line between Spain and the United States. And there, in the east part of what is now Texas, it's the Sabine River, and then goes up to the Red River. They chose rivers because, obviously, given that they didn't have detailed maps or navigation methods, it was much easier to use the river as the line of demarcation. Looking beyond the Spanish possessions in what is now Mexico, the United States under President Monroe issued a very sweeping and somewhat surprising declaration known as the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, the goal was to prevent any future European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Spain, Britain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Russia all had colonies in the Americas, and so President Monroe's declaration did not impact existing colonies, but it was only designed to prevent new colonies. And the background for the Monroe Doctrine was, at this time, you had major Napoleonic wars in Europe, which had led to France occupying the countries of both Spain and Portugal. And given their weakness, the colonies of Spain and Portugal both had their revolutions at this time and wars for independence. And by 1821, 1822, most Spanish colonies from Mexico to Chile, the tip of South America, had become independent. A few years later, the large country of Brazil became independent from Portugal. However, there were rumors, somewhat accurate, that the European monarchs were planning to help Spain recover its American colonies after these many countries had become independent. For that reason, 1823, President Monroe issued what's become known as his Monroe Doctrine. And in that, he stated there could be no future colonization by Europeans since it would be, quote, dangerous to our peace and safety. He also said the U.S. would not interfere with existing European colonies in the Americas, and some of these still exist, and some existed for much, much longer. For instance, the country of Belize, just south of Mexico, was British Honduras until about 30 or 40 years ago. And President Monroe also said the U.S. would keep out of the internal affairs of European nations. And Americans in particular like this last point because this was very consistent with President George Washington's farewell address, in which he said Americans should not intervene in the affairs of other countries. Now, no European nation has ever recognized the Monroe Doctrine under international law. It's never had any official standing, but it has had a major impact on U.S. foreign policy since the 1820s regarding foreign countries' involvement in Latin America. And we'll see a lot more of that in History 1302. Here is a political cartoon, actually, that I use in the next course, but this shows the importance of the Monroe Doctrine. Here we see these large steamships. These are U.S. warships. You can see the flag there. And on the side, they say Monroe Doctrine. And then on the right, we see what are supposed to be the greedy European rulers with their telescope looking at Latin America, eager to go and conquer in Latin America to acquire the natural resources. So this political cartoon portrays, from an American publication, the American attitude on the importance of the Monroe Doctrine. And this was from around the year 1900. And finally, the Monroe Doctrine is important at this time that we're studying now because it shows the United States' real determination to become a world power. The United States basically said in 1823, Latin America is what's often called America's backyard. It wasn't specifically called that, but it's been regarded that. There have been many, many U.S. military interventions in Latin America. Again, we won't really see those until the next course, but most of them justified using the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, thank you very much.